Hello and welcome to Iowa Ideas. We will be discussing the challenges of local news in this segment. Before we get started, I want to give a special thank you to ITC Midwest, the presenting sponsor for Iowa Ideas. Its support and the support of other sponsors for certain sessions and tracks makes possible this event and allows all of you to participate at no cost. I also want to add a big shout out to the Gazette for organizing Iowa Ideas. This is a huge undertaking, but it's an important opportunity for people from across Iowa to come together and to learn more about issues that confront our state. And finally, I want to thank all of you for taking part in our session. You will be able to submit questions to the panel by entering them in the Q&A box or the Zoom chat, and we will try to work those into our conversation as we proceed. My name is Randy Evans. I will be the moderator for the next 60 minutes. For the past 10 years, I've been the president of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council. And before that, I spent 40 years as a reporter and editor at the Des Moines Register. I want to now introduce our panelists. I will have them tell you about themselves. Let's start with Debbie, and then we'll go to Susan and Dave. Debbie?
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today. My name is Debbie Anslem, and for the past 2 years, I've had the pleasure of being the executive director of the Iowa Newspaper Association. Prior to that, I had about 20 plus years in the industry working for both publicly traded companies as well as family-owned operations.
Good morning. My name is Susan Patterson-Plank. I work for Rebuild Local News, which is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works on public policy across the country, and with the goal of increasing funding for journalism.
Good morning. I'm Dave Buzik. Thank you for joining us today. I am a retired journalist. I spent 3 years at WHO Radio in Des Moines after college, then 40 years at KCCI as a reporter, anchor, and the last 30 of those years as the news director. Since retiring at the end of 2018, at some point in there a few years ago, I started writing a column on Substack on media and its intersection with politics.
So to get our conversation started, I think since the topic is the challenges of local news, why is local news, why does it matter? If a newspaper or a local newscast disappears, how does this affect a community? So Dave, why don't you get us started?
Well, I think that the answer is somewhat obvious in that we all need information. Society has solved many problems in the past. There are still many problems to go. There are always problems. And we need to be able to understand what the problems are so that policymakers can address those problems and try to find solution, whether it be crime or healthcare or economic equity, those kinds of things. So I think that journalism shines a light both on the positive things that are happening in society and also the negative things that are happening in society. I've always said that journalists aren't smart enough in general to decide how to fix the problems. That's up to policymakers, but it is our job to point out what the problems are. And the problem that we have right now is that we used to be able to agree on what the problems are. Today, we can't even agree on what the facts are, much less what the problems are, much less what the solutions are. Some of that is the decline of a statewide newspaper that we all depended on for many decades in this state. And some of it is just the nature of the internet, where we all search out things that satisfy our own opinions and desires. So I think that it's also, I'll just say one other thing. I think that it's a journalist's job to hold those in power, hold their feet to the fire and hold them accountable for wisely spending taxpayer dollars, for doing the best they can on behalf of most of the people. And that's our job. And so that puts us in a somewhat adversarial role that we've always had with those in power. And today it seems like many of those in power are using that against us and casting us as the bad guys, as the enemy of the people, when in fact that's our role, is to kind of play the devil's advocate and make sure that those in power are being held accountable.
Debbie, Susan, what would you add?
The thing I would add is, we know one of the things happens when there's less coverage, whoever that is, we see even more polarization, right? We also see voting going down. We see fewer people running for office. All those things over time have a huge impact on a community. And those are things you may not see right away, but over time it happens, which is really has a long-term impact on the health of the community.
Yeah, I'll just finish it out by saying I think this idea of our role in strong communities is, they always say you need a good schools, good parks, and I would say you need a good local news outlet as well. I think people are really understanding our value, and we're starting with all the problems we've had. Looking forward, we are seeing a growing understanding of the difference between local media and national media. And research and surveys are showing that people actually really do trust their local news sources.
So how much of the change that is occurring in Iowa is a result of the audience's appetites changing, and how much of it is a result of technology and changing the way information is available? Susan?
I think I don't have the magic number. If I did, I'd be doing something else probably. But I do think it's the combination of those things. I think the other thing that's happening out there is, and out there when I say that, I mean across the state, is a shift in what's happening in rural Iowa too, right? It is harder to support news outlets when there isn't a main street, right? Going back to what Debbie said, there are certain things we have to have in our communities to be healthy, and I think that is another factor that sometimes we don't always talk about, and that is what's happening in our state with regards to how people are moving from rural places to larger, more metro areas, and even the impact when we think about the internet. We in the industry tend to think about how that's impacting news, but the other thing it has done is it has impacted our main streets too, right? Because there is so much easier to make a purchase and have it show up on your front step this afternoon from Amazon than it is to walk downtown and go to the hardware store. So I think there are lots of factors, but some of those things are things that we kind of forget about besides the impact of the internet on news.
And I would add that they're absolutely related because prior to the internet, we always had what we thought of as an appetite for news. People would get off of work at 6 o'clock and want to know what happened during the day while I was working. They'd get up in the morning. What happened while I was sleeping? What happened yesterday? So they'd read the newspaper on the front step. Now we're so inundated with news throughout the day that they get home from a hard day's work, and the last thing they want to do is find out what's happened in the world because they haven't been able to avoid it all day. So that's, from the consumer standpoint, news consumer standpoint, that's a significant change in how they use our product.
Well, and I do think the other thing is, to Dave's point, people get inundated, but I think there's research that shows people actually are taking in more news than they used to. So the appetite, I think there's still an appetite. It's just a little bit of a math problem, right? Because there's so much more opportunity for it to be coming to you. But I think people are ingesting more content today than they ever have.
Yeah, and they're absolutely overwhelmed by it. I read an article a few months ago about you'd get up in the morning and you'd read about the world events, which are often negative, for 15 minutes, then you'd go about your day, and then maybe you'd watch the news at night. But now it's all day long. And so there's also just I can't take it anymore, and an avoidance of the news that's a real issue today.
So on the local news side of things, how much of the changes that have occurred, I mean, it almost seems like it's a chicken or the egg thing. You talk about Main Street getting smaller, which I think probably leads to fewer advertisers showing up, whether it's in a newspaper, a printed product, on a local website, or on a local broadcast. And the the reduction in revenue, I'm no genius, but it would seem like that's translating into fewer people who are out gathering content. Are we kind of creating a vicious circle here economically?
Well, I'll jump in on this one. So, I think, Randy, it's a really interesting point. And I think for a long time, people have worried so much about, at least in the newspaper industry, print versus digital. It doesn't matter. Our message going forward is we are platform agnostic. We actually, because we have we have a print platform, and now we also have a digital platform. We have more ways of reaching people, and our audiences are actually bigger than they've ever been. The problem and what people see is the reduction of one side, and they haven't seen the growth of the other side. So our local newspapers do not have an audience problem. What they have is a business model challenge. So, and that revenue challenge is absolutely tied to shrinking mom and pop businesses who traditionally place those ads. And it's also tied to big tech in really two ways. So one of the things that has happened is, as we see our content as local content producers being shared on both social media and places, in Google searches and what have you, big tech is running ads that we used to get. So they're winning on our backs. They are taking our content without our permission and serving it up in searches. They're keeping people from bouncing back to our sites. So they take it without our permission, without recognition, and without compensation. And so not only do you have the missing revenue stream from local retailers, but we're also losing that share of the pie that's going to big tech companies. And the difference is, as local newspaper publishers, they put money back in your local community. Big tech is not. Now, we are not anti-big tech, so I don't want to sound that way. But what we are trying to do is introduce legislation that allows us to negotiate with big tech for our rightful place and for a seat at the table. And I think, Randy, as we look at the expansion of AI, that's going to become even more important part of the conversation. I do think consumers are going to want to know where their sources are and who's providing that. And, as local producers of content, we need to be compensated, or those sources will go away. So,
yeah, I would love to jump in and add a little more on the AI, right? Because I think one of the things that people are not understanding is that you used to do a search, right? And you would get results back, and you would decide, where do I want to click, right? And then I would go to that site, and that site might be a local newspaper, it might be a local TV station, it might be a local, you click to them. But now, because of AI giving you a summary, you're reading the summary and you're just moving on, right? And so in the past, there was at least the opportunity to monetize your traffic, but lots of media outlets are seeing a decline in their traffic from search. And that is having a big impact, right? So I just wanted to add context to help people understand why that AI summary is impacting your local news provider.
And on the television news side, I think, newspapers have been in this difficult revenue situation for 10, 15, 20 years. And it's starting now on the TV side. I think the TV largely avoided it for a long time because video was hot. But it's now happening because of just so many streaming services and fractured audiences. And I don't care how, I was very proud to have started the first TV news website in Iowa back in 1995, which was the early days. And, we basically gave away our content. And I don't care how much that has grown. The revenue from that digital content will never overcome or surpass the revenue from TV broadcast, because you pay, if a car dealer wants to be in the 10 o'clock news, he or she pays $500, $600, $700, $1,000 for a 30-second spot. And then, there's 4 spots per commercial break and 4 or 5 breaks per newscast. And so that really adds up pretty quickly. On the digital side, I mean, an advertiser may pay $100 for 1,000 clicks or 5,000 clicks, and it's just never going to overcome. So that's a real that is not.
He agrees.
Right on. The other thing on TV news is that we've been propped up a lot by political every other year. Political just goes through the nuts, it goes nuts, goes over the top during a political year. And in Iowa, we have always benefited because instead of having every other year political cycles, because of the Iowa caucuses, 3 out of 4 years, we've had very significant political dollars leading up to the Iowa caucuses in January or February of the even-numbered year. So I think that has allowed television stations in Iowa to kind of punch above their weight, despite their sort of medium market size. But with now the Democratic side of that gone away, that's going to further erode political income for local television news operations.
So where in there is the solution to the sort of the economic health of news providers?
Well, I think a couple things. First of all, I think there are a lot of national organizations, Press Forward, Rebuild Local News, Knight Foundation, who are working on it from kind of a global landscape, which is a good thing. You have groups like News Media Alliance who are helping us, America's newspapers, figure out what our policies should look like going forward to address some of those problems. So that's the good news there. I think, at the state levels, we are a couple things. Messaging is super important, Randy, in this space, because what we have to do, the research will tell you that, citizens believe community news is good for their community, and they see it as a community service, just like they do utilities, good roads. The problem is government doesn't pay for that, nor should it. They have to understand their subscriptions mean something, and they need to show up and support that if they really believe it. The second thing is we need to develop kind of a third leg to the stool. So you have your revenue, your ad revenue, you have your subscription revenue, but now the models seem to be a third leg, which is a philanthropic leg to the stool. And so we are working really hard on that and looking at areas where it makes a difference and we can fundraise around that. So making sure that means technology support, that means civic engagement and media literacy, and it means all those things that kind of support the industry in general. So we're working hard on all of those things, and I think we're starting to turn the corner, which is encouraging. The other thing, like every industry, we're looking at where we can make partnerships have more impact. So how do we work with our journalism schools? How can we use those opportunities to really produce quality, robust content? Because research will also tell you if you have good quality content, people will pay for it and show up for it. So, the hard thing is an industry, we never stop. It's kind of like healthcare, right? We're 24/7 with the news, and it's hard to break from that and address, big movement. But, I'm very optimistic. I think we're getting close to that.
Debbie, let me ask you, is Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post an example of philanthropic support? The doctor out in LA owning the LA Times, is that an example of philanthropic support?
No, it is not. But I think what you see, like Report for America is an example of that. So Report for America, which helps a local newspaper fund an additional local reporter for somebody like the Telegraph Herald, and there's other newspapers in the state using that. And it lets them onboard, another reporter over time. They eventually have to pay for it, but it lets them, it's a good financial way to do that. And so that's an example of philanthropic support.
Well, yeah, and I'm going to jump in because one of the things that we look at, and I can appreciate not wanting government to be engaged in news. So we work really hard to make sure that we're providing policies that have the guardrails around that, right? Illinois just recently passed legislation that gave a tax credit back to media outlets based on the number of journalists that they employ, right? So there's no impact on the content in any way, shape, or form. But that $15 tax credit, which is a refundable tax credit, which in other words is a grant, right? That goes a long way to help support news. And in some states, there's a realization that even though this is a business, it's a business that our communities really need and rely on. And so there are policies that are being put together at state levels, just trying to provide that financial support. I'll just give one more example. There are a handful of states that have passed legislation that it's a little bit of like a shop local, right? That says your statewide agencies that are spending dollars, that a percentage of those dollars should stay local, right? And shouldn't always go to a tech company that isn't reinvesting in a state. So I think, one of the things I think we will all agree on is that we got to try all the stuff, right? We have to try to be profit. Some people are going to try nonprofit. Some people are going to try philanthropic. There are organizations at the national level looking at legislation, organizations looking at the state level, looking at, policy options. We all got to keep experimenting.
I heard someone from MacArthur Foundation speak, and they were talking to a group of potential community supporters here in Iowa, and they said, whatever your cause is, if it's arts and if it's environment, whatever it is, your number 2 cause should be your local news outlet, because those are the people that are covering what you care about. So interesting perspective from a foundation.
I love that, and thanks for sharing. I'm going to start using that.
So talk a little about, because I'm not sure that most Iowans would be aware of it, the role that nonprofit news sources are playing in our state right now. I'm thinking of Iowa Capital Dispatch, which has, in the course of 6 or 7 years, has come from non-existent to a source of what I would call authoritative coverage of government and higher education. So do you see that? How do you see that fitting into sort of the traditional news source mix?
I tell when I talk to groups, I tell them that they really need to expand their diet, their news consumption, to include sources that they trust. And I always mention Iowa Capital Dispatch. There's Axios, Des Moines as well. But I think Iowa Capital Dispatch in particular does a really terrific job sort of replacing the State House reporters who have really flown out the door at every state house around the country, including here in Des Moines. So I think they have determined a niche for themselves, and I think it's important for people to read them and to support them. But there's this whole Substack phenomenon as well. Sometimes there's original reporting that happens on Substack. A lot of Substack columns, like my own, are pretty much taking what I read and consume and then trying to put it together into some kind of a cohesive narrative with some opinion and analysis that's put on it as well. So Substack is another thing that's there. But I think the days of just sitting down and reading the morning newspaper and watching the 6 o'clock news and being informed are long over. I think you have to subscribe to a national news source that you trust: the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, whatever it may be, Chicago Tribune. But if you only pick one, you're going to be woefully uninformed, misinformed. If you only depend on Fox News, if you only depend on MSNBC for your news, you're getting a skewed image. So you've got to broaden your horizons.
I mean, I think one of the contributions that Iowa Capital Dispatch has made is that its content is available in a variety of ways. People can go to Iowa Capital Dispatch's website and get the content at no charge, or they will be encouraged to donate. But it is also available, and I see it in newspapers around the state as well as broadcast stations that will pick up Iowa Capital Dispatch's reporting and repurpose it, which is part of the business model of Iowa Capital Dispatch and its sort of sister news sites in other states. And I think that has added a dimension to the news content that is directly available in small town publications. I see Iowa Capital Dispatch reporting in Iowa weekly newspapers that I read. And I think, to Susan's point about there is no one solution, I think that's one of the examples is that, there's going to be a variety of ways that local news sources are going to strengthen themselves.
Yeah, I think it's also, just to add a little different perspective, it's also important for small communities to understand they need to, it's okay for publishers to charge for digital content. It doesn't all have to be free. And I'll give you an example. I was talking to a publisher yesterday in rural Iowa who said that he has people in his community who copy the article off his digital site. You have to pay for a digital subscription, and then puts it up for free on a social media platform so everybody can read it for free. And when he asked politely, please take that one is copyrighted, but take it down. Then, got all kinds of comments about how the evil newspaper is making people pay for the content. That reporter has a right to earn a living, and it costs money to do what we do and to do it well. And I just don't feel like we should have to apologize for charging for online content. It should be worth it.
Well, I think you've hit upon something that is continuing to nag newspapers, particularly, is that in the early days of online websites, the content was there free, and readers became spoiled, and it's hard to change habits.
Yeah.
So, Dave, you wrote a couple of months ago about a study, and I think it was it Rebuild Local News' study about the number of journalists that are employed around the country. Can you kind of highlight that for the group today?
I'll tee it up, and then Susan, who works for Rebuild, can fill it in. But basically, they did a study that in 1999, I think it was, there were an average of 40 local journalists for every 100,000 Americans around the country. And that doesn't include network correspondents, that kind of thing. These are local journalists, local TV, newspaper, radio, internet. So by this year, 2025, that number had fallen to 8.2 local journalists for every 100,000. So what does that mean for the folks who are watching today? That means you're not getting the coverage of the school board and the city council and the board of supervisors that you used to get. You're certainly not getting coverage of the arts, of movies, of architecture, all those things that used to be covered, because there's just so many fewer journalists today. And in fact, out of the 3,000 counties that are in the United States, fully 1/3 of them, 1,000 counties, had less than one local journalist. So what that means then is that people are having to depend on social media to get their news. And that's just not going to end up helping anybody, because I don't know about your Facebook feed. Mine in the last couple of months has just been filled with stuff that's just flat out wrong. I never used to get that, but I'm getting all this stuff that is clearly just clickbait and is clearly factually wrong. And I don't know what to do about that. I don't know what I clicked on to get that, but you really have to filter it out. So Susan, what else?
Yeah.
Do you need to know?
I'll add that across the country, what we believe is that there's been a decrease of 75% of the number of journalists, right? Good news, bad news. So everybody is not. There's no state doing well. Is the short answer. If you look at all the states, Iowa comes in about number 10 or 11. So Iowa's doing better than many states, right? Which is good news. With also the fact that all states are down significantly. And to Dave's point, if there used to be 4, there's 1, right? Again, good news, bad news. There are states that are much, 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 much worse off than Iowa. Iowa does relatively well when compared to its peers. But one of the reasons we did that study was because we want to keep doing that every year to see where is it getting better anywhere or is it getting worse? If it's getting better, what are those communities doing? And then, that data is actually open source data. If researchers are interested in diving in on that data and crossing it with other information, they can do that. So we're hoping long term we learn a lot from that experience.
So Susan, following up, what are you seeing around the country that sort of give you hope in the way, what positive examples can you point to? There's lots of good little stories, right? Recently, there was a newspaper in Alabama that was about to close, and it was a small community, and their economic development organization in the town bought the newspaper because they knew how important it was for there to be a newspaper, right? So there's lots of little pockets of stories that way. I mentioned the Illinois public policy change. I mean, that's significant. You were looking at some policies like that across the country where you might get a tax credit for a reporter of $15,000. And if it's a new reporter, there might be another $10,000. I mean, that is significant in the ability to hire more reporters. That's the problem we really want to fix, whether that's through finding new sources to help people with keeping newspapers from closing. And some of that is just because of, and Debbie can speak to this more eloquently than I can, there's newspapers that they're owned by mom and pop and there's no one to take the newspaper. So, we're also looking at policies about how can we help those people who want to come in and buy these kinds of newspapers. So there's lots of things, but there are lots of shining examples across the country where some good things are happening. Can you pick up on that, Debbie, about the sort of the generational change that has been occurring and is continuing as longtime traditional owners are aging out of the business, and who's picking up the slack?
Sure. We have in Iowa 235 newspapers who are members of our association, which is good news. That said, we have 15 counties that have one community newspaper, and in some places it fits the description that you just heard. So as an association, what are we doing? There's really 3 things that we are focusing on, but one of those is to ensure sustainability for newspapers. So we're trying to figure out what succession plans could look like and what are good models. We saw, I think is it 2 years now, where University of Iowa Student Publications, the Daily Iowan, purchased 2 community papers. And, fast forward to today, that's going very well. Is that a model in some places? We just helped a community whose newspaper decided to just close their doors. And there was actually 2 people in the community, a handful, who wanted to keep those doors open. And we helped them learn what it takes to run a newspaper. And they now have started that newspaper back up. And so kind of to Susan's earlier point, there isn't one answer. we at the association are trying to figure out what are a couple good models and how can we help facilitate that transition. What I will tell you, we're spending a lot of time on, to your point about the next generation. It's more encouraging than people think. So we are spending a lot of time with high school press associations. We're getting involved in mock trial. This year, there's a court reporting track, which teaches high school students how to be court reporters. We just started talking with IJAG about what could involvement look like from their side. And the important thing is we're planting seeds in thousands of young people's minds about what local journalism is and why source is so important. And they know it, they believe it, and they are really enthusiastic about it. So they might not read it on a print, piece of paper that lands on their doorstep, but they are reading it online. And to me, it's about the source of the content and having a locally produced and trustworthy, authentic, transparent source. And I think that's kind of the message that's resonating with the next generation. I'll tell you, we're also leaning into, our J schools are doing really good work, and we are leaning into that and figuring out how can we help future journalists. Today, they have to know every platform. Dave, to your point, they have to know how to take a video on their iPhone and post it in 30 seconds and make sure the content is right. We used to have a conversation in our newsroom about, is it first or best? Well, these days it has to be both. It has to be first, best, and right. And so to have accurate posting is important. And the next generation understands all things and they're embracing those. And so we're leaning into that and trying to support those journalists. I think the hard thing is, as a journalist, you have to know a little bit about every industry you cover, and you have to know about, Randy, we just had a conversation with your group. If somebody doesn't let you in a courtroom, what can you do about that? Can you raise your hand? And so I think this ongoing education, back in the day when you had 10 colleagues sitting around a newsroom and you could ask those questions, today they might be the only one in the newsroom. So making sure that we are lifting up that generation and helping them on their journey is even more important, I think, in roles for us as an association, because they don't have maybe the robust support in their local newsrooms.
So Dave, if you could sort of speak to the broadcast side of this transition that's occurring, because, it's a whole lot easier to start an online news site than it is to start a broadcast station or to take over a broadcast station as a mom and pop. Where do you see this all going with broadcast?
Well, what's happening is some regulatory issues. I can geek out on this for a little bit, but I think we're all familiar with what happened a week or two ago with Jimmy Kimmel and Sinclair and Nexstar. Nexstar is the largest owner of television stations in the country. They own 200 of them. And right now, federal rules or laws prohibit any one station owner from reaching more than 39% of the households in the country. So Nexstar wants to buy Tegna, which is a spinoff from Gannett, and that's another 65 stations. So they would go over that 39% cap. But the other rule that would violate is that current rules by the FCC don't permit any one television station owner from owning more than one of the top 4 rated stations in any given market. So what Nexstar wants is to take over Tegna, buy it, and have the FCC remove those ownership caps. Here in the Des Moines market, what that would mean right now, Nexstar owns WHO-TV, the NBC affiliate, and Tegna owns WOI, the ABC affiliate, and KCWI as well. So they currently, if they buy Tegna, if Nexstar buys Tegna, then they would own WHO, WOI, and KCWI. And so what you could have happen is that if WI, which is the 3rd rated news station and always has been historically, their news operation could go away, or WHO could decide to just simulcast their news on WY, and then you lose a voice. That's the problem. You lose a voice in the community, a source for new content and different content. They could do something short of that. They could have reporters in the field just feed stories to both stations while keeping separate anchor teams. But all of this stuff plays into the Kimmel decision because Nexstar needs the FCC to remove these ownership caps. And that's why it seemed just wrong and inappropriate for them to so quickly agree to pull Jimmy Kimmel off of the air. Now, of course, they reversed that and they put Kimmel back on. But all of this stuff is happening in what's happening in our country and what's happening in Washington and happening in our government is that you're going to have massive consolidation, which has certainly happened to newspapers. It's certainly happened to radio, to, I think, very deleterious effect on local news operations and radio stations. And when it happens, because it's probably going to happen on TV news, I think you're going to see a number of lower rated news stations in markets all over the country that the economics just aren't going to work anymore, and they're going to shut those stations down.
So where do you see the changes in public media? And I'm thinking now of, Iowa Public Radio or Iowa Public Television. How is that fitting into all of this? Because it seems like both, the Iowa Public Television and Iowa Public Radio have both been sort of quality content creators through the years.
I don't know if you want me to take a swing at that, I will. But I mean, I just think this whole perception by those on the right that somehow NPR and PBS have been left leaning is just crazy, certainly in terms of how it affects the local stations here. I mean, public television in Iowa is just a tremendous resource. You can't watch Iowa Press and say that they swing one way or the other politically. You can't watch Iowa PBS's coverage of the state fair and say that that swings one way politically or the other, or market to market. They do all this tremendous programming, and it is just taking this perception and trying to lay it across the whole country. And that's exactly what's happened to local news, is that the perception and the criticism that comes of the TV news networks, CNN, NBC, ABC, Fox News, people take that broad brush and they hit all of us. I have to tell you, in 40 years in local news, we came to work every day wanting to hit the ball down the middle of the fairway, and do good, tough coverage of everybody who's in politics. Emphasis on the tough. You have to do tough coverage. So, I mean, I think it's just a misperception, or it's just too easy of a target for those sitting in Washington to say, NPR is terrible, when they know nothing about Iowa Public Radio. And you would think, and I guess I'm showing my political stripes here, but you would think that Iowa's Republican congressional delegation would raise a hand and say, wait a minute, we've got some pretty good networks here in Iowa, but that has not happened, sadly.
Well, I mean, picking up on the perception, the big story in Iowa and in Des Moines in the past week has been the arrest of the superintendent of the Des Moines Public Schools by federal immigration agents, and the commentary on social media has been that a failure of the school district to not properly vet the candidate, but also a failure of local media to not finding out that he was in the country without authorization, that he didn't have the academic credentials that he claimed to. And, from my vantage point, after having spent 40 years as a den mother, sort of looking over local news coverage, that ascribes some motives that I'm not sure are deserved. When I was when my hair was a little darker and was a reporter, there were the Des Moines Register and Tribune. There were two newspapers. They had two reporters at every school board meeting. Now you have one reporter who may be at
maybe.
the school board meeting. And you have fewer eyeballs just looking over a story, an issue that is evolving. It is easier for things to be missed than when you had more eyeballs looking at it. And I think that's from, I'm on my soapbox now. From my standpoint, that's what people in Iowa ought to be concerned about, is that we need more people looking over what state and local government is doing, not because it's one side or the other is good and one side or the other is bad, but just citizens don't have time to go to the meetings themselves, and they're looking for somebody who's going to step in and tell them what they ought to know about. And
I will say, I think the journalists have done a good job since this story broke of ferreting out more details that the school district didn't know about, even on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Monday, about Ian Roberts' academic background. Now there was some kind of a restraining order served on him shortly after he took the job. So, I mean, I think journalism has done a good job there. But honestly, it would have never occurred to me in 40 years that when a new school superintendent is hired to go, I wonder if that guy is a citizen or not. I mean, it's just not something that's ever happened before.
But I think that, I think back to, when the state universities would hire a new president, it was par for the course for the Register or the Tribune or the Gazette to go sort of do an in-depth profile of who this person is, talking to people that were co-workers or people in the community where the person was from. The more questions that are asked, the more likely you're going to be to find out if there is something untoward in the person's past. And having fewer people asking fewer questions isn't a recipe for avoiding problems going forward.
Right.
I'll climb down off the soapbox now.
Well, but Randy, I think, it's just one more example, going back to the top of the hour, of why your local media is so important and why people should care about our health as an industry and want to help us find creative ways of making sure we have reporters in communities across the state. It just, it's just another example of what happens when we're not there. It's also, I think, an example of, we often don't talk about the advocacy work we do and the work we do at our state houses, making sure we keep policies that protect transparency and freedom of information and all of those things we do. None of us get compensated for that. That's just work we do. And kind of goes back to that philanthropic conversation. Are there funders out there that care about that and can support that work? Because it's so important to our role in communities.
And picking up on that, I think that, the role of citizens in communicating with their legislators about the importance of transparency, government transparency, and it's through transparency that citizens are able to hold their government accountable. And in Davenport, a good bad example was the aftermath of the collapse of this apartment building across the street from City Hall that killed 3 people. The public, the citizens of Davenport, with the good reporting by the local journalists, were asking questions about why their local government wasn't being more proactive. And the citizens were stunned to find out that there had been secret settlements reached with city leaders who were supposed to be looking out for the public safety and welfare. And I think the feedback from those citizens to their legislators has led to changes in the law that put more teeth in the law, that increase the penalties for government officials who violate the law. And I think that's, to me, that has been a classic example of how ordinary citizens uh, putting their voices together with their friends and neighbors can have an effect on what the legislature does. So, how much of the sort of evolving nature of the public's attention or public consumption of news, how much of this is being colored by the sort of the political divisions in our country? I mean, are local news sources being penalized, if you will, because of the perceptions of that people are deriving from either of the cable networks that they're consuming information from? I mean, it's almost as if the talking heads on cable television are creating negative reputations for local journalists who really aren't contributing to that division.
Well, the Pew Trust just released a study this week that shows Americans' trust in media from 1972 to 2025. In 1972, it was in the upper 60%, and it went up shortly a few years after that, above 70%. In 2025, that has plummeted to 28%. And if they just put Republicans in that study, it's 8% of Republicans trust mass media. So I mean, that's really bad. Now, some of that can be blamed on us for not doing enough to let people know how we do our jobs and educating them, letting them into the process. But I think an awful lot of that can be blamed on the constant stream of criticism that comes toward local news. And on the broadcast side, that goes back to the end of the Fairness Doctrine under President Reagan in the early 1980s, where the Fairness Doctrine dictated that local broadcast radio and television stations had to do both sides of the story, had to interview both candidates, had to demonstrate that in the reports to the FCC. And Reagan got rid of that. And then that sort of opened the door to the Rush Limbaugh, who would, day after day after day, pound the so-called mainstream media, lamestream media, as he called it. When I was sitting in the news director's chair between 1 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone would ring off the hook with people who were just mad about the media. And it was all usually older white guys. I can say that because I am one who had been listening to Rush. And, they knew that I would pick up the phone. There was no point in calling the New York Times or CBS News. And so we'd go round and round and round and talk about it. And when you have a president of the United States calling the media the enemy of the people, he's got a lot of supporters, and that's just going to hurt us. So there are tremendous headwinds, both economically, which we've talked about, and politically, which we have also talked about. But this lack of faith in local news that's demonstrated in this Pew Charitable Trust, I mean, that's just, it can't go much lower. It's very disturbing.
But, when I was back in my working career, before the Register, I was the editor of 2 weekly newspapers. And I walked down Benton Avenue in Albia, Iowa. Everybody in town knew who I was, and if we had missed a story, or if we had botched it, or had misconstrued something, I couldn't get from one end of the town square to the other without somebody or multiple people telling me that I had fouled up. So it was harder to escape the feedback that you were hearing on your telephone, but in Washington or New York City, the editor of the Washington Post or the New York Times could walk across the city and nobody would ever say anything because they didn't know who that was. And from my vantage point, that has affected sort of the responsiveness of local media versus the responsiveness of national. It's harder for you to botch a story in Des Moines, Iowa, or in Albia, Iowa, than it would have been in Washington or New York.
Randy, the challenges, to Dave's point, are enormous. But, I think as industry leaders in Iowa, we're trying to figure out how can we start making steps forward, what's in our control,
Mhm.
and what can we do. And so, this is just one really small example, but something that we launched this summer is called Political Voices. And what we did was we worked with both parties, red and blue, said, we're going to give you a topic each month, and we'd like you to write your party's perspective on this topic. And newspapers who choose to participate will run both columns at the same day, at the same time, next to each other, and let our audience decide. That's a really small step, but it's a step in the right direction of getting us back to a point where local news can be a catalyst for conversation. We can share that with our audience, and our audience can make their decisions. And we've had really good feedback from it. We have about 60 newspapers who are participating. Both parties are willing to come to that table and wanting to try to make this work. And when we have that kind of dialogue, I think that's really important. We have to lean into it, and we have to keep up that good, those good efforts and those good fights.
Well, I think that's an example that bubbled up from, from those Main Street publishers. Yep. Who were answering their telephones
Yep.
and listening to their readers. Susan, are you seeing similar kinds of things occurring around the country?
Well, I think it's similar, but I also want to point out that trust in institutions, whether it's government or media or I don't know, your WNBA officials. I mean, trust is something that we're talking about a lot right now.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I want to point out is in all those situations, the closer you are to home, the higher your trust is, right? Whether that's your media partner or it's your government official. And there's research that shows that too. And I think that is consistent around the country, right? I am more likely to trust the person that I may, to your point, Randy, run into in the street or the soccer or at my church. And whether that person is a reporter or if that person is a legislator. I think that is consistent across all institutions right now. And a lot of that is because of lots of different factors.
So, Dave, if you were still sitting in the news director's chair at KCCI, what would you be doing, today to try to rebuild that trust relationship with your viewers?
I think I'd be doing more to intentionally sort of lift the veil. And that's one thing I tried to do with my column, but lift the veil and let people see our process, what we went through. I see way too much lazy journalism these days where something happens and then the reporter goes out, print and broadcast, and just grabs the X statement or social media statement from Ashley Hinson, Chuck Grassley, Zach Nunn, on and on and on, and puts that on without challenging it in any way, shape, or form. And to me, that's lazy journalism. So I think I first of all, I would be banning all of those written statements. If you want to give us a statement, we're going to want to challenge you and ask questions of you and make sure that we're not just taking something that your PR person has written. But I think I'd be doing more to explain. And some stories, they do this. Here's the process we went through to get the facts. Here's who we asked questions of. Here's who did not respond to us, despite the fact that we reached out to them by phone, by email, and knocked on their door. So I think that goes a long way in explaining the work that we went through to get the story. Beyond that, I think you've just got to, I started a series of doing brown bag lunches with people who wanted to come in and just talk to us, anybody from the community. We ended up getting a lot of people who were really hungry and wanted a free lunch, but that's okay. We still got some good feedback about what we were doing well, what we were not doing well. So you've got to somehow in a methodical way, make sure you're getting feedback on what you're doing that people like, what you're doing that people don't understand, and what you're doing that what you could do more to help viewers value your product.
Back when I was the assistant managing editor of the Register, and I would get those kinds of phone calls and emails. One of the things I would do when somebody was really insistent about bias was that I would invite them to come in, and sit through the morning or the afternoon news meeting to just see what the process was like, because the comment I would make to them, by the end of the evening, you're going to realize that it was a miracle that we got the newspaper published. That there was no time in the day to orchestrate what kind of a message we wanted to, what kind of a skewed message we wanted to put out. And I think being approachable is one of those important facts that we need to do a better job of communicating to Joe and Jane Citizen. So I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I think the clock is running out. I'm looking for so I would take this opportunity to thank once again all of you for participating in the group session today. I want to thank once again the sponsor, ITC Midwest and the Cedar Rapids Gazette. And I encourage all of our viewers to stick around for the other sessions in Iowa Ideas. I think you'll find it's a good time. Thanks a lot.